Our final speaker is Professor Moshe Hellinger. He is an expert on political thought, Judaism and democracy, the state of Israel, Israeli society, and religious Zionism in Israel. He is the past head of the Schwartz Center for Ethics, Judaism, and the State at Bet Morasha. He previously ran a program for religious secular dialogue, as well as the program for democracy and citizenship at Bar-Ilan University. He is an active public speaker and an advocate on issues related to promoting the Jewish identity of the state and bridge conflicts in Israeli society.
Two preliminary remarks. One, I had the honor of meeting Rabbi Sachs on separate occasions, and I invited him here to Bar-Ilan in 2003 when I was the head of the program for a religious and secular dialogue in the university. He delivered a lecture, amazing lecture, and spoke with the students. And for many of them, it was one of the most important events in their academic life at Bar-Ilan. Later on, we continued writing, and then he invited me to visit him at home, and I came and I visited him, and he even gave me then his Agadah Shel Pesach, in which I'll read some sentences later on. And even we thought to write a book together, but unfortunately, it didn't come out. This is one. The second thing is, in the last 15 years, the translations of Rabbi Sachs' books into Hebrew became a great hit in the religious Zionist community in Israel, especially within the religious Zionist community in Israel. Well, after what we heard now from Dr. Schwartz, and for somebody who reads or knows the writing of Rabbi Sachs and some of his speeches as well, that is not a very understandable thing. Because the gap between Rabbi Sachs and what happened to religious Zionism in Israel in the last 25 years is quite big. Religious Zionism became more nationalistic. Rabbi Sachs is very pluralistic, much more Democrat. And his vision of Israel, which is profoundly Zionist and religious Zionist, is closer to the religious Zionism of 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, not the religious Zionism of today. So many times I ask myself, what happened? So the answer is that, for me, is so interesting, is so relevant for individuals and for people, religious people, that people tend to disregard what he has to say about politics or the future of Israel or things like that. Okay, I start with that because Rabbi Sachs is the most influential religious rabbi, maybe not only rabbi, religious person in the Western world in the last 30 years, undoubtedly. I can't think of anybody else who influenced not only Jews, Orthodox and non-Orthodox, but non-Jews, as a spiritual leader, figure, inspiration, as Rabbi Sachs. Certainly in England, where he had regular radio programs and some television shows, but also in other places. I speak here as an Orthodox Jew, don't have today, and didn't have in the last 20, 30 years, figures who were so important. And the vacuum that is left after his passed away so early at 72 years, I don't see anybody else who can fulfill it. So for me, personally, his absence is quite tragic. Okay, I want to focus now, after saying that, I want to focus on one key issue in Rabbi Yitzhak's thought that is relevant from the beginning of his writing till the last books, and is one of the most, maybe the most important issue in Jewish political tradition, and one of the most important issue in Western political tradition, especially current Western political tradition, but not only. And the issue is how you can combine, if you want to combine, between universalism and individualism at one hand, and collectivism and particularism from the other. Because individualism is quite different. Sometimes it really contradicts collectivism. When you are with collective identity, your individuality is only part of the collective, if you go to the extreme. If you go to the extreme of individualism, so the uniqueness of yourself is by being individual. The same about universalism and particularism. Universalism includes everybody in the world, and particularism makes differences between separate nations, religions, communities. So can you combine both individualism and universalism from one end and collectivism and particularism for the other? Rabbi Yitzhak's answer in the affirmative. And it's very important in his worldview. One. Second thing is that usually in our life, always, in the most important issue, it's not either or. I see myself as a religious person. You see, a black yarmulke I learned in yeshivot Harediyot. I was Haredi till I was 30. I'm a religious Zionist in the last 30 years. I was very different as a Haredi. I'm very different as a religious Zionist. And when I see myself, I know, as so many people, that I'm both religious and secular. In our life, usually it's not either or. It's both things. And the question then is how much from both things. Whether you are more liberal or more Zionist, more Democrat or more elitist, more universalistic or more particularistic. The issue is what is more, but not either or. We present ourselves as something free from other influences, but it's not the case. And the uniqueness of Rabbi Yitzhak is, and here is really rare and very important, that he goes in a road toward combining Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, with liberal democracy, but from a particularistic point of view. That is more than universalistic point of view. It's both. But he stresses in all his work more the particularistic side than the universalistic side. And that is very rare, because usually when we see thinkers, politicians, rabbis that stress the part of the particularistic Jewish identity, usually they don't go to become liberal Democrats. They are more nationalistic. They are more fundamentalistic. So that is an amazing thing. And a huge contribution of Rabbi Yitzhak, not only for Jewish scholarship, but Western liberal scholarship. And there, he is close to the communitarianism, but not all the communitarians, but to the sort of thinking, or the school of thinking, of liberal communitarian, which I'm also part of it. That you give the debate between, we saw in the first presentation, the huge debate between communitarians. There was a very important book, Communitarians versus Liberals, and then it was so certain, as usually people think, that liberalism is individualistic liberalism. But historically, it's not the case, because there were two strands of liberalism. There was the liberalism that started from the big three Johns. John Locke, in the 17th century, individual liberalism, and then it went to John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, and then it concludes in the thought, not only, but specifically John Rawls in the 20th century. Wow. But against that strand of thinking, there was the Republican liberalism that later on became the Communitarian liberalism. And in the past, it started with Spinoza, went to Montesquieu, and later on to Alexis de Tocqueville in the 19th century. And today, communitarian liberals such as Charles Taylor, Michael Walzer, some others, in part Michael Sandel, etc. So you don't have to be liberal individualistic. And Rabbi Sachs spoke specifically on communitarian in politics of hope, but it really is around all his work. He brings Judaism in not only because Judaism is so important to him, so dear to his heart, but because Judaism is the key example, according to Rabbi Sachs, of having a moral foundation of society and state that starts with Abraham when he goes out to Canaan. Particularism. After the days of Adam Arishon, and later on Noach, and the covenant of Noach, and the covenant later on of Abraham, and covenant is very important in Rabbi Sachs' thinking. He always speaks about covenantal society. He's not the only one. There were other people he was influenced from, like one of our professors, Professor Daniel Elazar, who spoke a lot about it. And before, there were other rabbis, Rabbi Hirschensohn and others. But he says that the covenant Judaism starts with the particularistic Judaism of language, of religion, of community. Religion is basically a community issue. But it can't be anti-universalistic. Here, he spoke before, but later on Michael Walzer, that Rabbi Sachs knew and speaks about and writes about, Michael, one of the key intellectuals and philosophers in liberal thought today, also in Jewish thought today. Michael Walzer spoke about thick and thin, that the way we should go to human rights is not like John Rawls and others, Ronald Dworkin and others, basically on universalistic abstract terms, but this will be only the thin, the first layer, basic human rights. But then there is the thick building, which is more particularistic, more communitarian from your own cultures. So Rabbi Sachs always speaks that the uniqueness of Abraham tells the story of a nation who sees herself as unique, but if it sees itself as unique, it sees other nations as well as unique. And this is not the regular particularistic understanding that we really know. Because we really know that people tend to be more particularistic, they tend to be more chauvinistic, more against the other, sometimes racist. Well, okay, I'll try and make it too. Okay, so that's quite important in his thought. I wanted to quote some quotes. I won't bring the quotes. But he starts always with the difference. Again, the dignity of being different. Here, he's closer to some postmodernist thought, especially to Richard Rorty. He's not like him, but in this specific point. Because Richard Rorty is, in my point of view, is the most important postmodernistic thinker, more than the French school, but I'm not totally objective here. So he starts his whole understanding about human rights, not as in universal human rights as in Kant's, or even John Locke natural rights, etc., but in the specificness of each person. And therefore, you can't be racist against anybody. So it starts with the uniqueness. So here, Rabbi Sachs is closer to him. Another intellectual who Rabbi Sachs was very influenced from was, of course, Yeshayahu Berlin. Yeshayahu Berlin, one of the key intellectuals in the liberal world, Jewish liberal intellectual. He always was the exception. And he's not postmodern. He inspired some of the postmoderns, but he was a liberal modern point of thinker, modernist thinker. And Berlin said that usually we see the Enlightenment as a way towards liberalism, democracy, because of its universal understanding of human rights and thinking and rationalism, etc. But that was, some of it was totalitarianistic, because everything is according to one universal understanding. And here just the other school, the Romanticism, says Berlin, the liberal Berlin, the Romanticism that spoke about the uniqueness of everyone according to the English school of Romanticism, or the uniqueness of every nation according to the German school of Romanticism, spoke about uniqueness. And Berlin says you can't go against the uniqueness of people. You can't try to have only one truth. And Rabbi Sachs was very influenced from this understanding of Berlin. They were close, and even was in his, he even spoke about him after his death. I'm finishing in half a minute. And he really tried to build something that combines universalistic and particularistic understanding. The last remark is this. The beginning of this, when you look at his books at the beginning, he speaks mainly towards the Jewish people, about what happens after Holocaust, Orthodox Judaism against non-Orthodox Judaism, etc. Later on, he brings the same point, but speaks universally towards all the world. And he really relates to the most important problems that are facing people today. In the book about morality, for instance, he speaks about the problem of individualism, goes back to Tocqueville, the problem of individualism that makes people be alone and more vulnerable. After us, later on, will come Professor Putnam, who spoke in his Bowling Alone. I don't know whether he is here, but he spoke about the problem of losing the social capital, goes after Tocqueville as well. And it takes the same understanding and facing the problem of divorce, of violence, everything goes to the same thing. The I, and not the we. And here again you see his communitarian understanding in his Jewish interpretation. Thank you very much.
I just want, how did Avraham Avinu's particularisms go to universalism? This is why I came.
Because look at the Parsha Lech Lecha. Lech Lecha me'artzecha moladtecha mibet avicha, being particular against all the civilization of Shumer, Akkad, etc.
He was particular
but
because he was
ve'ischa
unique.
לגוי גדול ואברך ונברחו בך כל משפחות האדמה, which means that his way in education, that he will inspire monotheism, morality, responsibility, not only for his family. It starts always with the family, says Rabbi Sachs. But it has to go to the people, and it can't stop with the people. It has to go later on to the world. 36 times, says Rabbi Sachs, many times, the Torah speaks about the ger, which is the non-Jew living in your country, the way you have to treat him with dignity and even love. So you can start, but from, it goes back like Aristotle and Plato. Can you really love somebody if you love everybody? Again, Rabbi Sachs is against Platonism. He speaks about it, the problem, the devil of Platonism. But, so you start with that, but it influences all humankind.
Avraham Goyim.
Avraham Goyim? Yeah, Avraham, his name. Okay.
I know that there are questions. So, there was someone who wanted to ask a question in the beginning. Sorry? Oh, yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Forgive me, I'm going to be one of the people who makes a statement instead of asks a question, because I want to relate to your question also in terms of what you said. I think in addition, or in parallel, Rabbi Sachs does have a major paradigm of the move from the universal to the particular. And your question in terms of Avraham Avinu, it very much comes as kind of his focus is on the particular, and he demonstrates this through beginning with indignity of difference, but also elsewhere, Sipur Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel, and Noah. And these for him are his universal paradigms. We don't know where they happen, we don't know who they happen to, okay? But they're big kind of paradigms of universalism. He says the whole story of the Jewish people, the particularism, starts at that moment when Avraham Avinu is commanded to go, and that is a particularist command, and that also makes sense in terms of the Jewish minority and modernity and how that plays out within the collective. So I think let me just finish my sentence. So in parallel to that, I think there is also a move from the universal to the particular that he does try to sustain and does sustain all the way through. And it would be interesting to track that in terms of the rise of religious fundamentalism.
Get Walter. But Rabbi Zaks, because the first layer is always the universal layer. But when you go to Rabbi Zaks, the way you see Babel, which is very important in his thought, you see the collapse of the universalism. You see the feeling of proud of human being about the Tower of Babel, but then the collapse to different languages. And this is the beginning of the tikkun. And then will come Abraham, who will bring the right way of the tikkun. So it's not only that there are two layers of universalism and then particularism, and when you need universalism when you are particularistic, but that the main thing is the particularistic, spiritual, moral way of Abraham. That's where I differ from you, and I think that's what Rabbi Zaks meant.
We can continue the conversation.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just have a question for Professor Meir. Yeah. So you spoke about Rabbi Zaks being disturbed about move from the Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft, but he doesn't idealize the Gemeinschaft. And then you had a quote about his opposition to any type of political imposition of uniformity or limiting any type of freedom. But the way I understood the problem with Gemeinschaft is more not political, but the social. Namely, that there's a social consensus. Because of a face-to-face type of community, you enforce conformity through consensus, through gossip, through social pressure. And that becomes the problem, which can actually sometimes be more powerful than political. My favorite story about Chametz, but anyway. So I just wonder if Rabbi Zaks addresses this problem with the community and the problem of imposed social conformity.
Okay, so thank you. So I think that the solution, perhaps, that Rabbi Zaks suggested to us is many different communities, many different types of congregations and associations living side by side in a given society. And once those values are not imposed by the state, but they are taken by each individual who decides to join a certain community, the solution of an imposition of collective values towards the members of this community is the exit. But you just move to a different community. Now that's not a perfect solution, but that would be the kind of the liberal, Tocqueville solution. I think that's what Zaks suggested. There's a big literature on the right to exit from communities, but I don't know if Zaks wrote about that, but that would be kind of the standard response. I think it's a good response.
I mean, the whole issue about leaving communities, even if theoretically they're voluntary, you try to leave certain communities, which I won't mention any names, it's very difficult. Yeah. Anyway.
Yes, so I'll just try and speak up. Fascinating. I enjoyed every speech so much. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Microphone.
Yeah. I just won't say anything important for the microphone. So it seems to me that the Home we Built Together, though I think we're right to put so much emphasis on it because it is such a central work in his political thinking, it was written, I think, very much with Western European states in mind. And the only place, I think, where he really tries concertedly to apply his political philosophy to the Israeli context is in future tense, which you get to at the end. Now, I wondered, really from the first two speakers in particular, but all three of you be interested to hear, because the third speaker said something I think is quite funny and true. I think a lot of people in the religious Zionist community read Rabbi Sachs, but there's a good section of them that when he gets to something a bit political, they kind of gloss over that bit and just enjoy the drasha of other parts. I want to know, do you think there are any political activists or political scientists or public intellectuals in Israel who are actively trying to realize what was really quite a broad brushstroke vision there in future tense? That's to say, the creation of a covenant that all Israelis, irrespective of their religion, could feel that they were part of. The spinning of a narrative that somehow that was somehow inclusive of all the communities. Is that actually on the kind of political intellectual agenda at all, or is it something we can hope will emerge in the future?
There are some the minority within Orthodox Jews in Israel. Modern Orthodox or intellectual modern Orthodox, some of them rabbis, some of them academians, intellectuals tried to work. I see some of them here. We are not too many, but try to build something like that. The fact is that none of us has the same of importance as Rabbi Sachs had, because he wasn't in Israel. Because he wasn't in Israel. Then it's like Rabbi, it's not the same, but like Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rabbi Soloveitchik wanted to be chief rabbi of Israel in 1935. He wasn't elected. Rabbi Amiel was elected. Who remembers Rabbi Amiel? Yeah, very few people who remember Rabbi Amiel. And Rabbi Soloveitchik, Baruch Hashem, stayed in America and raised thousands of rabbis and inspired so many Jews in a very complex vision. Rabbi Sachs was influenced by Rabbi Soloveitchik, of course. So that you can do when you are abroad. Maybe that's why he's a great hero, the Rebbe of Chabad, the Chabadski Rebbe. Because of him he became a rabbi and so much influenced other people. He changed all his life. He was in America. It's easier.
Okay. If I can add a word to that, in 2001 here at the university, there was this dialogue between Rabbi Sachs and the author Amos Oz, which was moderated by Professor Jonathan Rynhold. And I thought about it. What?
Never heard of it.
And
just say it loudly. Just we can hear you.
And I thought, what can be the basis for the good relations that they had? At least if you read the dialogue, it seems very warm and very friendly conversation. And you think, okay, but in the 1989 book of Rabbi Sachs, Traditional Alternatives, he is quite critical of secular Zionists. He called them secularists, which I think Amos Oz would be one of them. But if we take into account, for example, one of the recent books of Amos Oz, Jews and Words, you see that surprisingly he holds the same view of what Judaism is, in the sense that it is not an ethnic group. It is something that's in words, it's something in tradition, in culture. So for Rabbi Sachs, of course, it would be the laws of the Torah define who is Jewish and what Judaism is about. And Amos Oz would have a much dynamic understanding of the tradition. But still, you can find partners of the views of Rabbi Sachs in different segments of society.
must add, I was there, and I spoke to Amos Oz after that conversation, and Amos Oz told me privately that everybody sees me as some sort of a leader of secularism in Israel. If I wouldn't see the religious orthodox in Israel, I would define myself as religious. Okay? And Rabbi Sachs told him then that if you want really to be a secular, you must live in Israel. Because outside Israel, you won't survive.
We have to conclude because we have another part of the wonderful program that we are all part of. So thank you very much, all of you.
Because of the connection to the US, Robert Putnam is going to speak via Zoom. So,
if anyone would like to pray the minutes of